All right. Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming again. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Uh, so we now continue the second session on the life of Ibn al-Arabi and his quest for the red sulfur. Uh, in case people don't know what that expression means, firstly, it's the title of one of the biographies that's written about Ibn al-Arabi, a magnificent biography written by Claude Adas. Um, Secondly, the red sulfur itself is an alchemical symbol for perfection. It is kind of the elixir that transforms base material into gold. And so it is one of the symbols for the Prophet Muhammad SAW. And so this is his quest for the same material that transforms our base material natures into sainthood. See Joshua. So here's the thing. One thing, Joshua. I cannot see comments, and I cannot see if anyone needs anything. So can you just please be my eyes and ears in case uh, the screen freezes or if people can't hear anything. So last time we were talking about just the beginnings of Ibn al-Arabi's life, his childhood in the quiet suburbs of Murcia, and then he moved to Sevilla, where he experienced a lot of urban life for the first time. And we learned a little bit about his family. We learned about his father and his father's love for him. And that Ibn Arabi comes from a military family, but more importantly, he also comes from a family of awliya. So then he has these life-changing events. He has the triple vision of Jesus, and then Moses, and then Muhammad, alayhi salatu wasalam. Yeah, losing sound? Okay, thank you. Let me know if the sound continues to drop. All right, all right. Yeah, let me know if the sound continues to drop. Um, he has these life-changing visions, and eventually he takes the firm decision to convert himself onto the journey of the path of the saints in order to reach knowledge of God. But of course, he also has his opening, his fatah, his illumination right in the beginning of his life as well, which is a very unusual thing to occur. So now what he does is he seeks the company of teachers who are saints in themselves, who can help him on his journey. So we're going to explore his meetings and his lessons, and we'll the lessons he learns from his teachers. And we'll learn a little bit about his teachers as well, because he's written a couple of beautiful books about them. And so this is the continuation of his quest towards sainthood. But before we carry on with that, I think it's important to understand what is wilaya exactly, which is one translation for sainthood. Some people don't like that translation, so they say friendship instead. But it really amounts to the same thing with some minor differences. What exactly is wilaya, and who are the awliya exactly? Well, we have to start with the prophets to begin with. So the prophets in traditional Islamic teaching, there have been 124,000 prophets throughout history, spread across the entire globe. And in every time period after that prophet, there must be someone to inherit his teachings, who is normally the what is called an inheritor saint, the waritha, because it is based on a hadith that first of all, the prophets, when they die, they leave neither dirham nor dinar, but what they leave behind is knowledge. And of course, that is knowledge which is outward, and it is knowledge which is also inward. the internal spiritual states of the prophet, and not just their outward actions. So with that massive collection of prophets, Muhammad is the last prophet who seals that line, so he's called the Khatam al-Anbiya. And with him, prophecy has ended, although what's interesting about sainthood is sainthood carries on. It has a beginning, or you could say it does not even have a beginning, because it's rooted in a divine name called Al-Wali. That's one of God's names. So it is eternal in a sense. It has no beginning, it has no end. So it picks up from where prophecy has left us off. Now, if there are these prophets throughout history, it is quite easy to imagine that there is a specific archetype for each prophet, or each prophet represents a unique archetype. So Jesus represents a particular mode of prophethood. So does Moses, Abraham, David, Joseph, and so on, and Adam and Noah, and all the rest of the prophets. So what does that mean for a saint? The saint, properly speaking, only obtains his wilaya through the inheritance of the prophets. That's how he obtains it, properly speaking. It is by following in the footsteps of the prophets that he obtains that sainthood. It is not possible to obtain sainthood outside of this compass, if you like. It has to come from prophethood itself. The saint must draw his achievement and his resources from the wellspring of prophethood. There is no other way. So then that raises the question as to which wellspring. So if there's a saint, for example, who inherits from Jesus, then he's called a Christic saint. So he inherits the knowledge of Jesus, and he also inherits the charismata, or called the miracles, the karamat of Jesus as well. And he inherits Jesus's internal spiritual state and his mode of perception, the way he perceives the world. So, for example, the Christic saint, if we can call him that, is someone who can walk on water, just as Jesus walks on water. He's also someone who prefers to have compassion towards creation, just as Jesus has compassion towards creation. And this is irrespective of whatever sect or creed you belong to. You are still deserving of that compassion. That is a Christic mode of being, right? A Mosaic saint, on the other hand, might appear to be a bit more stern. Perhaps a Christic saint likes to have hope, whereas a Mosaic saint might be more dominated by the attributes of divine majesty. And so light illuminates from his face, literal physical light. Just as happened with Moses when he descended from Mount Sinai and his face illuminated. So he required a veil to be put over his face so that people wouldn't be frightened by him. And so on and so forth. So it goes without saying that the Islamic saint only achieves his spiritual perfection by imitating Muhammad, and it's based on the Quran and the Messenger of God. You have what's called an uswatun hasana. You have an excellent and beautiful example. So it is by following in his footsteps that one achieves and realizes his sainthood. And this is because if it is the case that there are 124,000 prophets in history, nevertheless, all the prophet belongs to Muhammad, because in a little bit of cosmology, what Ibn al-Arabi discusses is that the Prophet Muhammad, quoting a hadith which is non-canonical, which says, "I was a prophet when Adam was between clay and water." So Muhammad was a prophet even before he was created and before the whole of creation was made. So all that prophethood belongs to him. And all the prophets derive their prophethood from him, according to Islamic teaching at least. So therefore, the prophet received specific privileges that have never been given to any other prophet before him. But conversely, no prophet has received a privilege that was not given in equal measure to Muhammad, because he was given the all-comprehensive words, Jawami' al-Kalam. And it is him, Muhammad, who assists every perfect man, whether he belongs to a prophetic religion or not. And his mercy embraces the entire universe. And so not only that, but the Ummah of Muhammad also encompasses every single being. All beings and all humans are included in his Ummah, because all you have is uh, Ummat al-Istijaba and Ummat al-Da'wah. But every single person belongs to his Ummah, without exception. Uh, and his mercy, by virtue of which he was sent, embraces the whole universe. Now, lastly, it's nice to quote something from Al-Junayd, who was a major Sufi, one of the major awliya. A pretty straightforward piece of advice, and which says, we do not become Sufis through gossip or debate, but rather through work, which is through hunger, sleepless nights, and sticking to good deeds. Um, and so, even though we've been discussing theory, it has to be put into practice. So this is what they used to do, and this is what they believed in. Now, it goes without saying that there is a wide variety and diversity of saints. So Abdulaziz al-Dabbagh, a major Gnostic, a major Arif Billah from the Kitab al-Ibriz, this is how he describes it. He says, whoever wishes to know the variety of the friends of God, that means the awliya, the saints, and the difference between them in their stations, their maqamat, and their states, their ahwal, despite them being all rightly guiding correct, and there's sweetness in the hearts of the people, let him look at the variety of these blossoms and flowers in this garden. So it's compared to a beautiful garden. Just as you have a variety of crops and a variety of plants and plantations and different kinds of flowers, some are large, some are big, some are sweet smelling, others are not so sweet smelling. Nevertheless, they're all part of the same garden. Some produce fruits, some don't produce fruits. Even some of their fruits are bitter, but they're still part of the garden. So, having said that, Ibn Arabi is really keen to show us the variety that there is. There is. So you've got young and old saints, and by young I mean very young. Male, female, rich, poor. Some are gentle, some are hot-tempered, and some of them have a sense of humor. Some don't. Some of them are illiterate, and others are very well versed and erudite. And others have personalities that attract you, and others have more abrasive personalities. Some of them, some of them are eloquent, some stutter. Some of them are physically beautiful. Some of them have more disagreeable looks, and so on and so forth. Um, and so, with that variety, you can still have saints who are in one of three modes of being. They can either be hidden and people don't know they exist, or they can be manifest. They appear in society and people know about them. This used to be the norm in the past. People would know their local awliya, their local saints. And some of them can be hidden whilst they're apparent, which is called khalwa fi jalwa. Khalwa fi jalwa, which is when they are walking right before your very eyes, but you have no idea that they're a saint. So, for example, perhaps someone with a certain kind of profession that no one would stop to think twice about, like maybe being a janitor, perhaps, a farmer, a teacher, anything. Um, and you would have no idea that he's actually a saint. Now, the way I like to think about it is that, well, firstly, Ibn al-Arabi talks about all these beautiful categories of saints. And when I say categories, he lists some hundred without exaggeration. So we're not going to go through them. But the point I wanted to make with these slides, as we just go on and on and on, right, is that despite the diversity of saints that exist and the different kinds of saints that there are and the different groups and categories that they belong to, they all form an intricate network, which is akin to an ecosystem, if I may put it that way, a spiritual ecosystem. So I love this metaphor. And there's a YouTube clip, which you can find quite easily. I think it's entitled Wolves Change Rivers. And so the short summary about the clip is that in describing a certain park in the United States, I think it's the Yellowstone Park, it was quite a barren land because there was a surplus of deers who used to graze on the land, so they would eat the grass. And so what happened was people introduced wolves into the same land. Not a huge amount, just some wolves. And so predictably, the deer population decreased. But once the deer population decreased, then naturally, the grass could grow again. Vegetation could thrive once more because there were fewer deers grazing on the grass. This was to such an extent that even the trees would grow by a few centimeters. That's how much change occurred. And so when the trees were revitalized, if you like, and revived once again, the birds came back. And so when the birds came back, that brought back other animals, and those animals brought back other animals. This was to such an extent that because the deers were not grazing on the grass, water returned to the land. Why? Because by not having anyone graze too much on the grass, it stabilized the banks. So water returned, which brought back more animals like otters and beavers, who constructed their own ecosystems. And that brought back ducks and a wide variety of other animals and so on. So that's an amazing metaphor, I think, because when you bring in one kind of saint, that or one kind of spirituality, like you might see from the Yemen, for example, right? Or Bilad al-Sham, for example, or Maghreb, that is the source for producing other kinds of spiritualities as well, and other kinds of spiritually talented people, right? So that's how I like to think about them. And with that in mind, we can now proceed to Ibn al-Arabi's actual teachers, who are the inheritors of the prophets. So since there's no way to gain or reach perfection without a teacher, the young Ibn al-Arabi sets off in search of them. Just as Ibn al-Arabi's first teacher was Jesus, his first master was Christic. So he says, my master was Christic. That means he's Isawi. That means he takes his mashrab, his spiritual wellspring, from Jesus, right? My master was Christic at the end of his life. So that's the station he reached up to. Whereas I was Christic at the beginning of mine, because his first teacher was Jesus. Now, this is Abu Ja'far al-Uryani. Uryani was an illiterate countryman who had just arrived in Seville when Ibn al-Arabi had just begun his quest. When Ibn Arabi tells us about his desire to join the path of the Sufis, he says, the first time I appeared in front of my master, that means Uryani, I said to him, give me a counsel before you look at me. He meant that literally, before you turn your head. I will keep your counsel, your nasiha, and you will only look upon me again when you see me invested in it. So he said to me, that is a noble and sublime aspiration. My child, close your doors, break all ties, and keep company with the all-bounteous. He will speak to you without a veil. I put this into practice until I had seen its blessing or benediction for me. I then went back to him and he saw me invested with it. So he said, like this, it is good. Otherwise, not. It was when Ibn Arabi was Christic, Isawi, that he experienced and gained knowledge of a variety of realities. One of them is how, yes, all bounteous. I will double check if it's al-Kareem. I'll double check. It was when Ibn al-Arabi was Christic that he experienced and gained knowledge of a variety of realities. One of them is how, when viewed in relation to God, absolutely everything is sublime. Everything in existence is noble, because there is not one thing which is not connected to some kind of divine reality. Because this will lead us next week into what's called wahdat al-wujud. There is no thing in existence except it has a foundation in God. That is where its nobility comes from. So from this point of view, there is no pre-excellence in one thing over another, as this story shows. Ibn al-Arabi tells us, I was once carrying something in my hands which people would normally disdain to touch and would not have been appropriate for someone of my social rank. It was a saltfish from the market. From the saltfish, there came a foul smell. My companions imagined I must have been carrying it for the mortification of my soul, which is kind of like mujahadat al-nafs. in order to kind of like beat my nafs up so that I can make spiritual progress. This is what his companions thought he was doing. Because in their eyes, my social standing would normally have prevented me from carrying such a thing. So they said to my sheikh, who was Oriani, so-and-so has been most zealous in his efforts at self-mortification, mujahada. So the sheikh replied, well, let's ask him what his reason was for carrying such a thing. So the sheikh questioned me when they were all present and told me what they had said. So I replied to them, you're quite mistaken in your interpretation about my action. By God, that was not at all what I had in mind in doing it. It was simply that I saw that God, in his greatness, has not refrained from creating such a thing. So, how then am I to refrain from carrying it? The sheikh thanked me, and my companions were amazed at that. Because if God saw fit to create it, then who am I not to carry it? That means there's something to this thing. If at any point you're confused by the stories, please don't hesitate to let me know. Another time, Oriani made a prediction which Ibn al-Arabi felt was incorrect and told the Sheikh so. And of course, don't forget, Ibn al-Arabi was still a young man or boy. So his youthfulness excuses, or at least explains, the lack of adab or propriety, which on his own admission, he sometimes showed his masters, but he generally was and had extremely good manners with them, extreme adab with them. He still had a great deal to learn about the rules of proper behavior, which normally govern the relationship between master and disciple. So he said, a difference of opinion arose between me and my master Abu al-Abbas al-Oriani regarding the identity of the person whose coming the Prophet had announced. He means the Mahdi. So Sheikh Oriani said to me, the reference is to so-and-so, son of so-and-so, and he mentioned someone I knew by name. So he thought he knew who the Mahdi was of his time. I had never seen the person, but I had met his cousin. I expressed skepticism and refused to accept what the sheikh said about this individual because I had an infallible perception, an infallible basira regarding the man in question. As it happens, there can be no doubting the fact that later the sheikh changed his opinion, but he suffered inwardly as a result of my attitude, although I was unaware of this because at the time I was only in my early stages, so I left him to return home. On the way, I was accosted by someone whom I did not know. First of all, this person greeted me with a great deal of love and affection in his gesture. Then he said to me, oh Muhammad, because his name is Muhammad. Oh Muhammad, accept what Sheikh Abu al-Abbas says about so-and-so. I understood what he was asking. I immediately returned to the Sheikh to let him know what happened to me. When I appeared before him, he said to me, oh Abu Abdullah, is it going to be necessary for Khidr to come to you every time you hesitate to admit what I say and tell you accept what so-and-so says? And how is that going to happen each time you refuse to accept my opinion? So I replied, the door of repentance is open. And he said, don't worry, the repentance is accepted. But then in another passage, he says, but listen, even so, things will turn out just as I said they would. He said to me, and then he said to me, it was I who was wrong and you who were right. Um, now, of course, when we say Khidr, uh, we are talking about the Khidr that is mentioned in the Quran. And of course, it is the belief of the Sufis that Khidr is one of the prophets or saints that are still alive today. In fact, there are said to be 4 prophets alive today. So now this is Sayyidina al-Qumi. Qumi was a wali who was Musawi. He was a Mosaic saint. So his inheritance was from Moses. Now, Ibn al-Arabi's relationship with his teacher was rather strange. The different anecdotes Ibn al-Arabi relates about Kumi, relates the profound veneration he had for this man. The love he felt for him was so sincere that he tells us he was able to make him appear at any time of the day or night that he wanted to talk to him in that very Star Wars-like way, just as the Jedi do. Um, and just like with what he did with Jesus. But more often than not, he experienced a reverential fear in his presence, which paralyzed him completely. And this is probably because of his Mosaic quality, revealing Kumi's inheritance from Moses. So Ibn Arabi confesses when he was having his lesson with Kumi on a mountaintop, when I stood in front of him or any other of my teachers, I would start trembling like a leaf in the wind. My voice would change and my limbs would start knocking together. When he noticed this, he would show kindness towards me and make a special effort to help me relax, which only increased my awe and reverence for him. Um, and yet, Ibn al-Arabi specifically tells us that in certain respects, he was Kumi's teacher. He helped me in suluk, what's called initiatic discipline, while I helped him in the states of ecstasy, that the ahwal that come from one's journey. He was for me simultaneously master and disciple, and I was the same to him. People were people were astonished, and nobody could understand the reason. This happened in 1190. So he would have been what, about 25 years old, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Um, in my case, illumination preceded discipline. He was the only one of my teachers who taught me any discipline. So this is where he learned the proper rules of suluk from. He learned it from this teacher, because Ibn al-Arabi, prior to this, he had no book knowledge, so he didn't read about Sufism. His knowledge regarding Sufism was, you could say, virginal. It was pure, it was new. And he said, look, I didn't even know the meaning of the word Sufism when I began this path. And so we might say this is an example of where Ibn al-Arabi is a teacher to Qumi. Yes, Khadija, could you bring that question back up in the end of the presentation? Because if I don't get to it, then just remind me, because that's quite a good question. And illumination means fatah. Get back to me again as well so I can explain more about it. It is what every Sufi strives for, illumination, a fatah, where reality is revealed to them, and the veils are lifted so that they can see reality as it really is, behind the veils of creation. So, this is Kumi. There was a time when I became accustomed to withdraw into cemeteries to isolate myself. I heard that my master, Al-Qumi, had announced, so-and-so, and he referred to me by name, has given up the company of the living because he prefers the company of the dead. This was like an implicit criticism. I sent someone to tell him, if you join me, you'll see whose company I keep. So he performed the dawn prayer, Salat al-Fajr, and came out alone to meet me. He searched for me and found me sitting between the tombs, with my head lowered, talking with the spirits who kept me company. He came and sat beside me, full of respect. I turned towards him to look at him, and saw that he had changed color and seemed ill at ease. He was unable to raise his head because of the weight that was pressing down on him. I looked straight at him, but he was unable to look at me because he was so disturbed. When I had finished my conversations and the spiritual instant, what's called the warid, had come to an end, the sheikh relaxed and, relieved, turned to me and kissed me between the eyes. I said to him, well, master, who is it who keeps company with the dead, you or I? And he replied, certainly not, by God. It is I who keep company with the dead. Now, I might have said this before, but I'll say it again. You notice the amount of detail that goes into describing these scenarios, right? If you're a movie director or a filmmaker, you can see that he's describing everything frame by frame, shot by shot. And I think that's a marvelous, strange thing to have done for someone who existed 850 years ago. And this really does feel like someone is watching a movie. It really is quite strange. So, not only did the dead speak with Ibn al-Arabi during his solitary retreats, so did God. He explains that the descent of the Quran into the hearts of the servant is the descent of God into him. God then speaks to him from within him, or rather from him and within him. This happens when the saint experiences the initial revelation given to Muhammad at its original source in all its freshness and newness through a shower of stars, what's called a shower of stars, nujuman, that descends into the heart of the servant, allowing him to penetrate into the infinite mysteries of the verses that descend on him by going back to the actual source of revelation itself, and thereby realizes new meanings that the ordinary person cannot see, which I think is such a beautiful image. Uh, so, what some of the major saints hope to do by the end of their life is they want to be what are called Hafad al-Quran. And if that sounds like a strange name, it is, because there are people who memorize the Quran ordinarily speaking, and they're called Hafad, which is a very common activity, but that's not what they mean by it. They mean they wish to receive the Quran the way Muhammad received it, and that is completely possible. And they hope to receive every verse the way he did it. So here's one example. This is the descent of the Quran, but in another form. So Sheikh Al-Akbar tells us, in a dream, I saw a being who was one of the angels. He gave me a piece of what's called agglutinated earth, which is a mouthful, but agglutinate means it's like a bunch of clumps. So it's like the earth clumped together with other clumps of earth, which is quite a strange image. Free of any dust and bottomless in depth. When I was holding it in my hands, I discovered that this piece of earth was none other than his word. Wherever you find yourself, turn towards him, thank me, and do not be ungrateful. And I was stupefied. I was amazed. I was unable to deny either that this was the very essence of these verses or that it was also a piece of earth. I was then told this was the way in which the Quran was revealed, or the way in which these specific verses were revealed to Muhammad. At the same time, I saw the Messenger of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who was telling me, "This is how they were revealed to me. هكذا أنزلت علي." Experience it for yourself. Can you deny what you are witnessing? And so we come to another one of his major teachers. And by the way, he has like dozens of teachers. We obviously cannot go through all of them, but I tried to pick out the big names. His name is Sharafi. And Sharafi, he lived in the same house without light or fire for nearly 50 years. So Sheikh Al-Akbar tells us, one day he came upon me while I was looking at the local madman. I did not notice him until he took me by the ear, pulled me away from the crowd and said, "Is this the sort of thing you indulge in?" At his words, I felt very ashamed and went off with him to the mosque. Although seemingly stern, he also clearly has a soft side. One day, he saw a young boy with a basket of fennel on his head, and the boy appeared to be very distressed. The sheikh showed sympathy to the boy, who asked for a supplication. By this time, a crowd of people had gathered around them. When he asked the boy what was wrong, he replied that his father had died, leaving several young children with no means of support. His mother had told him to take the fennel she had, and if that were sufficient, to sell it for a day's supply of food. At this, the sheikh wept, and putting his hand into the basket, he took out a few grains. Then he said to the boy, "This is good stuff, my boy. So go and tell your mother that your uncle from Al Kharafe has taken some of it, thus putting himself in your debt." Then one of the merchants took the basket, saying, "The sheikh has taken some of it, so it is full of his blessings." This is because of the idea of karamat and barakah. If you have someone who is considered holy, if you have someone who's considered holy, sometimes their own touch is believed to produce blessings. So then people will treat that object they touch as something worth buying, which was exactly his intention here. I do not know what inheritance Sharafi was from, but they all have some sort of prophetic inheritance. That's a good question. I actually leave it to the audience, you guys, to maybe have a guess. So then the merchant went off and paid the boy's mother 70 mu'min dinars in the basket, because what the sheikh did, he did that because it was intended as an act of mercy. And of course, not all of Ibn Arabi's teachers were male. He had female teachers too, given the diversity of saints, right? This one is Fatima bint Nun. Although this lady of Seville was over 90 years old, her face was so pink and fresh that Ibn al-Arabi would blush whenever he saw her. So she had like a relatively young face, even though she was 90. She ate food scraps that people left in front of their doors, but when she found neither charity nor scraps, she would exclaim, "O Lord, to what do I owe this high rank, that you should treat me the same way that you treat your loved ones?" Ibn al-Arabi and two other murids, disciples of hers, built a hut out of reeds as a house for her, and that's where she would live. And so Ibn al-Arabi also used to say he had no hesitation in saying that she was a mercy for all the worlds. And she was this wonderful woman. And for her part, Fatima had no hesitation in saying, "Of those who come to see me, I admire none more than Ibn al-Arabi," which might have made some of the students a bit jealous. So on being asked the reason for this, she replied, "The rest of you come to me with parts of yourself, leaving the other part of you occupied with your other concerns, while Ibn al-Arabi is a consolation for me. For he comes to me with all of himself. When he rises, it's with his whole self. When he sits, it is with all of himself, leaving nothing of himself elsewhere. That is how it should be on the way." And so while we're on the subject, it's worth noting that for Ibn al-Arabi and his school of thought, there is no spiritual degree a man can reach which a woman cannot, including the highest rank, which is called a pole, the Qutb, which is the station where a saint maintains the entire cosmos. So he says men and women have their share at every level, including the pole of the universe. So this is a wonderful story that I think is worth telling. So I'm gonna read it out. And it's how she helped a distressed woman who came to her. So this is what Ibn al-Arabi says about her. "One day, when I was with her, a woman came to see her to complain of her husband, who had gone away to Sidonia, 2 days' journey from Seville. She told us that her husband wanted to seek another wife in that place, which she found hard to accept. Naturally so. I asked Fatima whether she had heard the woman's plea, and begged her to call upon God to restore her husband to her. I actually got an interesting reaction once in one of my classes with this story. Maybe I'll tell you about it later. She said, "I will make no supplication, but I will cause Surah Al-Fatiha to follow behind him and bring him back." I then said, "Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate." And she recited the rest of the surah. Then she said, "Oh, Surah Al-Fatiha, go to Jerez de Sidonia, to the husband of this woman, and drive him back at once from wherever you find him, and do not let him delay." If this is confusing you a little bit, it is because it is literally what it looks like. She can conjure up Surah Al-Fatiha the way Ala conjures up a genie from a lamp. She can conjure up Surah Al-Fatiha, and then like a physical form appears to her, and she tells that being or that form what to do. It's like an embodied Fatiha, exactly. So she said this sometime between noon and the late afternoon. Sorry. On the third day, the man arrived at his home. Then the woman came to inform us of his arrival and to thank us. I then told her to bring her husband to us. When he came, we asked him what had brought him back from Jerez, when he had intended to marry and settle down there with another woman. He replied that he had left his house in the middle of the afternoon, heading towards the municipal building for the marriage, and that on the way he had felt a constriction in his heart, and everything seemed suddenly very dark to him. At this, he became very anxious. Then he left that place and arrived in Triana before sunset, where he had found a boat back to Seville. Thus, he had sailed the day and before. He had sailed the day before and had arrived in Seville that morning, having left all his baggage and things behind in Jerez. He admitted that he still did not know why he had done it, which is really ajib. And so this beautiful saint and waliya, she also used to love playing the drums. She might play the drums in celebration of this event. Actually, I'm not sure. Ibn al-Arabi also has another teacher who doesn't like listening to music, and so one time he plugged his fingers in his ears and motioned to Ibn al-Arabi, let's go somewhere else. So it's just interesting again to think about the diversity of people and saints. One who plays music and the other who abhors it, right? Then we have this man, Ash-Shakkaz, who had a sense of humor. He gracefully outwitted two ladies in a verbal joke they tried to play on him. I think it was even like quite a crude joke. So one day he went to the quarter of the Banu Salih to soak some skins in the river and then to stretch them out in the sun. As he was doing this, a woman of Seville passed by. The Sevillians and their womenfolk are a witty and graceful people. She called her companion over to her and suggested to her that they enjoy a joke at the fellow's expense, since he was a tanner. It must be explained that among us, the word shakkaz means one who is engaged in the bleaching and softening of skins, and that the people of the locality use the word as a nickname for men who want nothing to do with women. In other words, men who are soft-limbed with the skins they work with, just like the skins they work with. So the woman came and stood by him, but he was absorbed in his dhikr, which he performed tirelessly. So she said, Assalamu alaikum, brother. And he returned the greeting and immediately went back to his dhikr. Then she asked him what he did for a living. He told her to leave him alone, knowing very well the reason for her question. Then she said, You're not going to get away as easily as that. So then he smiled and said, I soak what is dry, soften what is stiff, and pluck what is hairy, thus avoiding the use of the word shakaz. So then she laughed and said, We wanted to catch him out, but he outwitted us instead. And it's just nice to see, like, you'll find quite a few of these people throughout history who really are at ease with themselves, and so they can laugh and have a joke. They're not so stiff. This master, his name is Al-Qaraq. He was young to the extent that he was only about 10 or 11 years old. In appearance, he was very shabby with a lean face. He was a thoughtful person, intense in his ecstasy and sadness. So, shortly before I met him, I had received inspirations on the way which nobody knew about. Therefore, when I saw him in the mosque, I wanted to appear as his spiritual equal. I looked at him, and he looked back at me and smiled. I then made a sign to him, and he did the same to me. Then suddenly, I felt like a fraud in his presence. He said to me, Be diligent, for blessed is he who knows for what he was created. Then he performed the afternoon prayer with me, took his shoes, greeted me, and was off. I went after him to find out where he lived, but I could find no trace of him, nor could anyone tell me of his whereabouts, and I've not seen or heard of him till this day. Then this teacher Al-Khayyat is the same one who taught Ibn al-Arabi the Quran when he was younger. I wanted to be just like him. So one evening, Ibn al-Arabi suddenly had a strong urge to be with Al-Khayyat and went to his house. When he greeted him, Al-Khayyat smiled and said, What kept you? I had my heart concentrated on you because you have something that I need, which basically demonstrated his power of concentration, which can produce sudden urges in the heart. And another time, Ibn al-Arabi was eating sweet pancakes and honey with the Sufis, and the honey ran out. So Al-Khayyat told everyone to clasp their hands together, and the honey began oozing from the edges of the dish until it was filled. Then we began to eat again, and there was more than enough for all. And Mertuli was a beautiful saint who had a valuable collection of books, and he sold them whenever a hungry person came to him. When he had sold the last book, that was when he died. And so Ibn al-Arabi says he belongs to the category of men who are called Rijal al-Imdad al-Ilahi wal-Kawni. These are the men whom God assists and who in their turn assist created beings. In every age there are three, neither more nor less. They seek assistance from God and give assistance to created beings with kindness, gentleness, and mercy, as opposed to violence, harshness, or severity. They turn to God so as to derive benefit from Him, and then turn to create beings so as to benefit them. Yes, could you please explain the link between the metaphor wolves change? Yes, okay. Please remind me again at the end of the presentation, just as soon as I get through it. But the idea is that just as how you have an ecosystem of animals and plants as well, when you change one aspect of that ecosystem, the entire ecosystem thrives. And I think that's a really good metaphor for the saints as well. So this is Abu Ishaq ibn Tarif. It's one of my favorite quotes. So Ibn al-Arabi says, one day I was with this sheikh at his home. I was listening and he said to me, my brother, by God, I only see people in respect to me uh, who are saints, from the last of them to the first of them who recognizes me. So in other words, anyone I see, I just assume he's a saint. Anyone at all, period. So I asked him, what do you mean by that, Abu Ishaq? He replied, the people who hear me either say good about me or they say the opposite of that. Whoever says good about me and praises me only describes me by his own attribute. Isn't that the case? If it had not been that he was worthy and the place for that attribute, the locus for that attribute, he would not have described me with it. So, in other words, if he says that I'm kind, it's because he has to be kind himself in order to recognize kindness. If he says that I'm brave, he himself has to be brave in order to recognize the bravery within me, and so on. So, in my opinion, that means what? That means he's one of the friends of God, one of the saints. As for those who speak evil of me, he too is a saint, in my opinion. God has acquainted him with my state. He's given him some insight into who I am. So he has, therefore, insight and unveiling, mukashafa, which means he sees by the light of God. So I think that he is a saint too. Therefore, my brother, I only see saints around me. And this is the extent of the excellence of his belief. And as you can see, like a lot of Ibn al-Arabi's discourse is characterized by something called husnadan, which translates to having a good opinion of God and having a good opinion of people. It really is the hallmark of his work. So you'll find that Ibn al-Arabi will pick out examples like this, and that these kinds of examples appeal to him. And then we have al-Rundi. He was one of the seven Abadal. He kept to the mountains and coasts and avoided the inhabited areas for nearly 30 years, and he came from a rich and noble family. I used to associate with them and keep company with them, which used to cheer him and cause him happiness. One of the things for which he was well known was his practice of sitting on a high mountain near Moron. One night, a man was on the mountain and saw a shimmering pillar of light, so bright that he could not look at it. When he approached it, he found that it was Al-Rundi standing in prayer. The man went away and told the people what he had seen. What does Abdal mean? The Abdal are what are called the substitutes. They are one of the highest categories of saints, or at least a high category. Literally, it comes from the word badal, to exchange, to substitute. So these particular awliya, saints, they have the ability to kind of like project their image in different places. So like, let's say we're talking about Rundi, one person in Seville might be talking to Rundi, and the second person literally in Morocco might be talking to Rundi, and they both say, no, we're the ones talking to Rundi, right? Because he projects his image. He has substituted his image. They're called the Abadal. And so Ibn al-Arabi also talks about how just these really minor points, which are really amazing. Ibn al-Arabi was asked by Rundi, listen, Here is a verse from the Quran which says, I require no provision from them, nor do I need them to feed me. That's an ayah from the Quran. So I want you to think about what it means. Don't tell me what it means. I'll ask you later on what it means. So then Ibn al-Arabi did not meet up with him again for 4 years. But then the very moment he met up with him 4 years later, he said, now the time is ripe for it. Let's have your answer. So it's just amazing that he remembered that particular question he asked him 4 years later. And it's interesting how they have this perspective where you don't take a superficial study of the Quran, but you have to let those verses mellow and sink and sit in your soul and kind of like incubate for years on end and let them mature and grow to fully gather its meaning, right? And then Ibn al-Arabi also says he was an illiterate man, just like Abu Ja'far al-Urayani, the Christic saint. One day I asked him about his weeping, to which he replied that he had sworn never again to invoke God's curse against any man, because he did it once and the man perished, which he had deeply regretted ever since. And you can see that like in general, the awliya are not men of wrath, generally speaking. Ibn al-Arabi goes so far as to say that you could technically be a wali of wrath, but then you're not one of the perfect ones by definition. You can't be perfect, tamam and kamil, if you're one of the saints of wrath. It's not possible. There's some deficiency in you, okay? Um, this is Al-Qattan. He would often shout and raise his voice before the nobles of the land, saying, these are the wrongdoers who perpetuate injustice in the land. May the curse of God, of men, and of the angels be on them forever and ever. Their punishment will not be lightened, nor shall they be granted any respite. And even the rulers were not immune from the severity of his denunciations. And he would present the truth forcefully to all without exception. We're kind of like running out of time, so I'm going to skip the story, but it's worth reading if you get a chance to read it. And then there's Ibn Mujahid and Ibn Qasum. And what they used to do is they used to record their actions, their daily actions in a notebook. And then they would do muhasaba, which is called taking themselves to account for it in the evening. And then they would say, oh, I did this thing, which is a good thing, I should be thankful for it. Or I did this bad thing, I should go make amends for it, or I should ask forgiveness for it. That kind of thing. So Ibn al-Arabi, Ibn al-Arabi inherited that same practice, but he took it a step further. And so he would record the thoughts that cross his own mind and demand accounts of himself for those very thoughts. And so these kinds of shuyukh, they're also called niyatiyun. They belong to the category of saints called the niyatiyun, those who have intentions, and they create this kind of spiritual energy through the use of their intentions. And then they implement that energy wherever they want. And then there's this Maliki scholar, of course, in Andalusia. Andalusia was the home for Imam Malik's madhab. So this is Ibn Munzir. He studied the Quran, language, and law, being alone in following the Maliki school. Among the wonders attributed to him was that when a difficult problem presented itself to him, he could see Malik himself solving it for him, who obviously died hundreds of years before that. Both spirits and men would resort to his house to pay their respect to him. Although he was poor, he once refused and returned some money which had been thrown to him. And the reason for that is that because usually saints have mastered the quality of what's called tawakkul, which is a really hard quality to master. The quality of being reliant and having dependence only on God. That's really like one of the most difficult qualities. And these are also peculiar spiritual categories. Like I said, there's like several dozen, but I'm just picking some of the more peculiar ones. Um, there are two groups called the Baka'un and Ahl Dahaq. Literally, Baka'un, the ones who constantly cry and weep, can't stop crying. And Ahl Dahaq, the ones who constantly laugh and can't stop laughing, even in their prayers. There are basically people who might be called clinically not insane, but there's a deficiency in their mental faculties. So they're called the demented, if you like. But I'm sure there's a more polite term for it. So Ibn al-Arabi meets them in Seville. Ali Salawi is someone who never stopped laughing, not even in his prayer. And the demented are those who have lost their reason as a result of a tajalli, a divine disclosure or a divine theophany, and a sudden seizure which comes from God. So Ibn al-Arabi says, their reason remains with God, rejoicing in the contemplation of God, plunged into his presence, overcome by his majesty. So they are reasonable men, but without any reason. So Ibn al-Arabi says that he has experienced that same station. For a time, according to what people have told me, I performed the 5 prayers and directed them as imam. I carried out the bowings and prostrations and all the prayer rituals, the gestures as well as the recitations, without seeing anything myself. I had no awareness of those who were with me, or of the place, or of what was happening, or of anything else in the sense perceived world. This was due to a state of contemplation which dominated me and in which I was annihilated both to myself and to everything else, which is called fana. They told me that when the time for prayer arrived, I recited the call to prayer and directed the prayer itself, but he obviously wouldn't be able to remember it. So I was like someone who was sleepwalking, right, without being aware of it. And then this is Qaba'ili, and we're going to come back to him in a little bit. His prayers could be heard by all creatures of the land and the sea, including the fish of the sea. He was also given to much weeping. And like I said, Ibn Arabi has something like more than 100 teachers, really. Because I'm just going to finish up in a couple of minutes. So not only were his teachers human, he also had non-human teachers as well. And so he says, among all the teachers I have benefited from along the other path among these communities is a drain spout I saw in the city of Fez along a wall from which fell the roof's water, like the drain spout of the Kaaba. I attended to its worship manner and exerted myself that perhaps I could flow with it in the same manner of worship. So I could just flow like the water that flows out of the drain spout, subhanAllah, right? And among them, the teachers, was a shadow that stretched out from my person, and I took from it 2 kinds of worship. It adhered itself to both of those worships, to both of those forms of worship. And as for the animal species, I have a teacher, or I have teachers among them. Among of all my teachers, upon whom I have been supported, was the horse. Its manner of worship is wondrous, and the falcon, the scorpion, the dog, the cheetah, the date palm, and others. But I could never reach their worship to the extent that they did, because it's kind of like innate to them. The most I could do was get that momentarily, while they could get there at every single moment. So Ibn al-Arabi completed his inheritance. It's not just a question of which prophet you inherited from, but you could potentially inherit from more than one prophet at the same time. So Ibn al-Arabi tells us that after he was Christic, he went on, so after he was Isawi, he went on to become Mosaic or Musawi. He then went on to become like Hud, alayhi salam, Hudek, Hudi, and so on, until he eventually inherited from the complete inheritance of Muhammad. So what he's implying by that is that he inherited the inheritances of pretty much all the prophets. Now, in spite of the necessity of having teachers, someone recommends Ibn Arabi in a dream, but scholars think it's Abu Medyan himself. Recommends Ibn Arabi in a dream not to formally affiliate himself with any of his teachers. That's why you don't see a tariqah that's called the tariqah of Ibn al-Arabi, because he's not affiliated with someone who came before him, right? He has a very unique stature. So this person in the dream, who could be Abu Medyan, said to Ibn al-Arabi, associate only with God, for none of those whom you have met has authority over you. It is God himself who, in his goodness, has taken you under his charge. This is also an argument for being what's called a mujtahid mutlaq and not adhering to a particular legal school. Now, we really are at the end of the presentation. So I do apologize. I'm gonna have to maybe skip this. And if you have questions about this, please, we can talk about them in the Q&A, or we can talk about them even in the WhatsApp chat room. But before we do that, I'm going to read one last story. This is pretty much the last slide. This is from the same Qaba'ili whose prayers could be heard by fish in the sea and animals on the land and all beings. So this is Qaba'ili. It was in the company of such men that Ibn al-Arabi had a vision in Cordoba in 1191 when he was roughly 26 years old. He said, "One day I left the company of the Sheikh and returned to my house, the Sheikh being in good health. That night I dreamt that I was in open country with low-lying clouds overhead. Suddenly, I heard the sound of neighing horses and the thundering of their hooves, and saw a company of men, both mounted and on foot, descending from the skies in such numbers that they filled the heaven. I had never seen men with such fine faces, resplendent clothing, and excellent horses. Then I saw in their midst of them a tall man with a large beard and silvery hair, his hand upon his cheek. I spoke to him and asked him the meaning of it all. He told me that the men I saw were all the prophets from Adam to Muhammad, every single one of them. When I asked him who he was, he replied that he was Hud of the people of Ad. On my asking the purpose of their descent, he told me that they had come to visit Qaba'ili in his sickness. As soon as I awoke, I inquired about Qaba'ili and learned that he had fallen ill that very night. He lived a few more days and then died." Now, was that the only reason for their momentous gathering? Ibn al-Arabi doesn't seem to provide an answer at first, but his own students tell us that they came for another reason as well. And that reason is they came to announce the person who would be what is called the seal of Muhammadan sainthood. The seal of Muhammadan sainthood. And to acknowledge him. And so we'll leave it there till next time when we'll learn more about the concept of seal of sainthood. Just as there is a Khatam al-Anbiya, there must be a Khatam al-Awliya. And that will also take us into the labyrinths of a doctrine that Ibn al-Arabi is very famous for, which is Wahdat al-Wujud. And then we'll continue the journey as he travels throughout the Islamic countries to reach his destiny. Thank you very much.
Jazakumullah khairan, Sidi. That was wonderful. Should we pause the recording or keep it going if people have questions that might be of value for others to see later?
I think we can keep recording for the questions, right? And then whoever wants to can listen to the questions. Inshallah.
Okay. There are a few questions in the chat that
Yes, please.
wanted to come back to. So I think you had explained this already in the WhatsApp group chat.
Yes.
But maybe for the sake of Mr. Khadija, you could quickly explain again the idea of the four living saints. You had a slide on it.
Yes, that's right. So basically, Ibn Arabi constructs a hierarchy of sainthood. The kutub's on the top, right? Now, if all prophets take their prophecy and prophethood from Muhammad as the source of all prophetic reality, what's called the Haqiqa al-Muhammadiyya, there are still nevertheless prophets who embody what is called a cosmic position. There are prophets who embody what's called a cosmic position. So Sayyidina Idris alayhi salam, Idris, he takes on the position of being the qutb, the pole that upholds the universe, which is a really interesting thing, given that the hermetic realities and hermetic sciences come from or are traced back to Idris or Enoch. And then you've got Jesus and Elijah. Jesus is what's called the Imam of the right, and Elijah is the Imam of the left. These two Imams, they are the wazirs, the wazara, who assist the qutb in maintaining the cosmos. So the Imam of the right is responsible for what happens in the spiritual world up above, and the Imam of the left is responsible. He's called the sword of the qutb. He's responsible for what happens in the affairs of this lower world. And then you've got the Watad, who is Khidr, right? Who is the fourth person. And of course, Khidr is the immortal guide who guides the saints, just like he guided Ibn al-Arabi. Also, you'll find stories about him in like the Kitab al-Abriz of Abdelaziz the Bagh and Ibn Ajiba and how he guides them too, right? So he's there throughout history if you believe that there's a man who's been living for the past few thousand years still alive today, right? Um, that's his role, to guide these spiritually talented people to their spiritual fruition. And then there must be saints who kind of like take the place of these prophets as well. So that means there is a kutub for each time period, and when he dies, he's got to be replaced by another kutub and another and another and another, right? Without that, then the cosmos is not maintained; it actually collapses. It's the same with the Imam of the left, the Imam of the right, and the Watad and the Autad. That's briefly it in a nutshell.
Does anybody else have any questions for Dr. Faris?
May I ask?
Yes, please go ahead.
Uh, uh, okay. My name is Sid. My name is Sid, and thank you very much for your, beautiful and very detailed genealogies of his teachers, and
Thank you.
it was excellent. I was
Thank you
just
so much.
curious about two things, and the very first thing is that I think in our last class we ended on a beautiful note, a comparison between Ibn Rushd and Sheikh Ibn Arabi, and that was on the reason and the Sufi adhawq, or the spirituality. And I think,
Yes.
to my understanding, it was really the beginning, as I think some of our brother has explained, with reference to with somebody, that this was the basic point where we can see a different streams of thought in the Muslim civilization. One was Sufism and the other was philosophy. Now, I
Yes.
just wanted to link it with Sheikh Ibn Arabi, as you were explaining, that he makes different categories of Sufis, right?
Saints. Yeah. Yeah.
I think, and then when you mentioned the metaphor of the wolves change the river direction, and that was also explaining a kind of a multiplicity. But I'm extremely sorry, because you have tried to explain two times, but I could not get an idea, because
Sure.
I just wanted to get into this, that what exactly do you have in the mind when the multiplicity of the saints, and then what do you mean by, that metaphor that explains the multiplicity, the incorporation of the multiplicity of the Sufism or Sufi trends? So I would love to hear from you.
Either some kinds of spiritualities and saints are so potent and so powerful, they can give birth to an entire spiritual community without exaggeration that then spreads across the four corners of the globe, like Ibn al-Arabi himself, right? And there's reason for that, because given his own position, which I won't mention right now, I'll mention it next week. And then you can have other categories of saints who, um, that category, for example, is really correct and is the right category for giving birth to other kinds of other categories, right? That category could be the reason that other kinds of spiritualities are then flourish, right? By the introduction of that group of saints or this particular saint, right? So Maulana Rumi is an obvious example, because then the tradition, the Mevlevi tradition, is practiced to this day. Why? Because Maulana Rumi gave birth to it through his teacher Shamsuddin Tabrizi, as this weird, strange, solitary wanderer comes into Konya and changes Rumi's life forever, right? So Shamsuddin Tabrizi would be recognized by Ibn Arabi as one of the afrad, which means one of the solitary, unique ones, one of the peerless ones. They have no equal in their age. There's no one who's really like them. Um, Dr. Eric Winkle, see Shuaib, uh, makes a very interesting observation. He says that some of these categories you can kind of envision them geometrically, right? So the afrad, because of the Arabic word fard, can also be translated as the primes. They're like prime numbers. They're only divisible by themselves. They're not divisible by other spiritual categories. They're not divisible by other people. They're unique in themselves. No one's like them, right? So they often give birth to entire traditions. So Rumi would be like one example, and there's just other examples like that throughout the entire world, thousands upon thousands, really.
I think
May I proceed with another question if possible? Or I can come back later also. I mean, because other
Okay,
systems.
let's
maybe
take
we
some of the
can
other
take
questions and then come
Arwa-
back, inshallah. Yeah.
we can take Arwah's question and then maybe come back to that later.
Bismillah.
Assalamualaikum, Sidi.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Subhanallah, I've been having this question on my heart since after Fusu's class, and I've been doing like and it has come through a study of like Surah Yasin. And I've been hearing different scholarly takes of how Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, upon receiving revelation or whenever he received divine revelation, that either he was very stressed and scared, and then I've heard other scholars saying very differently that it was such like a loving and joyous process. And I was wondering, because you did mention about the Awliya receiving Quran like revelation, what was
Yes.
it in Ibn Arabi's experience? Like how would he describe that process for Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the saints as well? Shukran.
Really, it's both. It's both. Maybe we won't say, I mean, perhaps stressed, but another word we might say is awe, and sometimes like great haiba. Haiba is the word. Great reverential awe, and sometimes maybe fear. But yes, you're absolutely right. It's both. It's joy and wonder, and it's also haiba and khawf and fear, because it depends on the nature of the revelation. That's what would explain it very simply. It's the nature of the revelation. Why? Because when Surah Al-Fatih came down to him, Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he said, nothing more beloved beneath the sun. There's nothing more beloved to me beneath the sun than the surah that's come down to me. Why did he say that? Because this is a whole thing, but just to make it really brief, in the first verse of Surah Al-Fatih, that is a bishara, a glad tiding, that Allah will forgive the whole of Muhammad's ummah. There's a glad tiding that He will forgive the whole of Muhammad's ummah, which Ibn Arabi then explains means not just Muslims, the whole of mankind. The whole of mankind. He will forgive the whole of mankind, but that's a long explanation. So he was joyful, right? And then you've got this other surah, like let's say Surah Hud, for example, and a surah that contains verses that kind of like sound like this, where Allah tells Muhammad, "Go thou straight, go straight." And the problem with that command is that we know that there is predestination, qadr and qada. So then Rasulullah said that he doesn't know what's written for him necessarily, right? So he says, those verses, shaybatni, they turned my hair gray. Not completely gray, but the gray hairs that I got were from those revelations, because he doesn't know whether what's written for him is obedience or not. So those kinds of verses stressed him out a lot, for example. So he got both kinds.
I think the next Sahar had her hand
Yes.
raised.
Yes.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
So I want to ask when you mentioned الحقيقة المحمدية and the Salah ala Rasul, that means when we do Salah ala Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam, that we connect with all the prophets, because we have a Salah al-Muhammadiyya and we have a Salah al-Ibrahimiyya.
Yes.
The Salah al-Ibrahimiyya is where we connect with the Sayyidina Ibrahim wa Ali Sayyidina Ibrahim, and then Sayyidina Muhammad wa Ali Sayyidina Muhammad.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so in this Salah al-Ibrahimiyya, we connect with all the prophets because all the prophets, they're coming from Sayyidina Muhammad, as explained earlier, right?
Yes.
So,
Absolutely. Yes.
yeah, so when we do that, we connect with all the prophets and all the saints like that, or
I mean, yes. I mean, let's say potentially, you are sending salawat on Sayyidina Muhammad and his family. Who are his family? They are the awliya who are upon his spiritual path and way. And then you're saying upon Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam and his family. Who are his family? The other prophets. So if I think you are saying salawats on all of them, potentially, but you're also making a connection to them potentially if that's where your focus and niyyah is. If you make that niyyah, then yes, you are setting salawat and making a connection to potentially all of them for sure. Yes, absolutely.
Beautiful. And before you said that the four prophets, there are four prophets who are still on earth, which one of them is Sayyidina al-Khidr and then Sayyidina Ilyas, correct?
Those who are on earth, and then Idris and Isa alayhum assalam are in heaven.
But you mean that they are alive in the أحياء عند ربهم يرزقون in general, like they are أحياء, like because
They're not ahya, well, you know, in the sense of they're shuhada, they're not shuhada, like they're physically around, because Sayyidina Isa will come back at the end of time, and Idris, he's like physically alive as well. Yeah, maybe yurzaqun, maybe, but like they're alive the way you and I are alive.
okay. And you said that there is زي خاتم الأنبياء, there is
Yes.
خاتم أولياء.
Yes,
So
yes.
that means that it's already في خاتم حصل, already it's done, or still أولياء still they are still there.
So beautiful question. I'm going to answer that next week. But
Okay.
the awliya are still here. They're still here to this day.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
Really great questions, because that touches upon what we've been talking about as well. Thank you so much, Sahar.
Elvina?
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Thank you for all the teachings. Well, while you were showing us about the shaykhs of Ibn Arabi, I just noticed a pattern. Maybe it's because it's a short introduction on them. I noticed a pattern that sometimes he would just like get taught only for one thing by those teachers. For instance, the Al-Qaraq, who was 10 or 11 years old, he didn't see him anymore. Or then about the non-human teachers. But I was wondering, how is this characterization done? Like, does Ibn Arabi call anyone a teacher who taught him at least something, like no matter how small, quote unquote, or yeah.
Your question is, how does he call him a teacher, right?
Yeah.
So Al-Qaraq, radiallahu anhu, is found in the book Ruh al-Quds fi Munasahat al-Nafs or fi Muhasabat al-Nafs. If you find someone in that book, he is Ibn al-Arabi's teacher. So yes, he considers Al-Qaraq one of his teachers, and you're right. It would seem that like even if if someone taught him just one thing, he would consider him a teacher. Because I think he's written this. I need to go back and double check. Because this is actually part of Wahdat al-Wujud. This actually connects to Wahdat al-Wujud. Why? Because if the whole of existence is God, then God can teach you anything from anyone, from anything. The whole of existence can be your teacher if that's what you want. That's a really good point.
Thank you.
Wow, Irvina, that's like a big subject. We just stumbled into a big subject. Jazakallah khairan, mashallah. Yeah, that's actually a big subject. Yeah, thank you.
There's a question in the chat, CD from Sana.
Yeah, and let's also work our way backwards as well, because I don't want to miss people from the back as well.
I think those are all the questions. This is the last one.
Great,
Where
great.
in Sidi Muhyiddin's work do you see that a woman can also occupy the position of the qutb?
In the Futuhat. Like, where does he talk about? In the Futuhat. All positions are open. Women are capable of what's called spiritual perfection. They can also become mad as well. Yeah.
Maybe one thing that I mean I would imagine this is a question that's on maybe half of our participants' minds, you know, because we only spoke of
Yes.
one female, I think, Fatima.
There are
In
others,
there are others that he speaks of, right?
for
Uh,
sure. Yes. Yes, for
Obviously,
sure.
there's a slight there's a predominance of male masculine figures, male men in his life, but
Yes.
you know, does he? Maybe we could ask the question like, what does he say about Sayyid Maryam, for example, or some of these major figures, you know, in the tradition, you know, like would she be considered a pull or one of this? How would you characterize some of these? You know, for there are turuq, you know, the Maryamiyya, right, paths and such. So, you know, does he say anything specific about particular important female figures in the tradition?
Don't get me into trouble, my friend. He says about Maryam alayhi salam that she was a prophet. Yeah, he holds her to be a prophet. And if you take the literal meaning of what's written in the Quran, Surah Taha, about the mother of Musa alayhi salam, she received wahi, quite literally. أوحى إليها. So Maryam is considered to be a prophet by Ibn Hazm and also Ibn al-Arabi. He considered them prophets as well. Um, yes. Now, I also have one question because it's directed to me. Sorry, so you can't see it in the chat, CD. What was the teaching experience you had when speaking about Fatima bint Noon? Oh God. And the woman complaining about her husband. Yeah. No, it was just an interesting story because there are quite a few, let's say, men in that classroom who thought, like, if it's halal to marry a second wife, then why is she doing that? That was a funny teaching experience. Like, how can she do that? Which I thought was really an interesting observation to make because, like, there can be things that are on a technical fiqh level correct, like technically correct, but you could be harming someone. You could be harming another human being. So the awliya obviously see that and step in.
I think one of the really interesting things that all of and the interesting aspects one of the things that makes Ibn Arabi's work and the vestiges that he left behind in all of his writings so interesting as well as like you mentioned the detail that he gives, right, and the variety of experiences and stories and states, right, and I was just reflecting upon my own lived experience, you know, and the day to day, how things change so radically from one day to the
Yes.
next internally, right? How one day we
Yes.
can be in a very elated, open state, you know, seeing potential and feeling the barakah around us, and the next day feel completely constricted. You know, it's that balance, the swing of the pendulum between qabd and bast, and
Yes.
being
Absolutely.
able
Yes.
to see again, like, and as you're alluding to with the perspective of wahdat al-wujud, you know, that ثم أينما التوكل, right,
Yeah.
this posturing really is what I think ultimately is the whole purpose of everything that he's sharing with us, is like showing this incredible diversity so that we can also apply that in our lives and be like, okay, amidst the fluctuations in ahwal, really, um, this is you can always find a center, right? There's always that centering perspective to bring us back to, okay, well, what's the opening in this experience? You know, what's the lesson? How is this polishing
Yes.
my mirror? So ultimately, it's all about clarifying our understanding and our perspective internally.
Absolutely. And then you don't get lost in that diversity as well. Yeah, Jazakallah khairan. Yeah, it's really important to remain grounded. Yeah, I agree. That's why like you also see Ibn Arabi being grounded as well. like throughout his discussions and the recollection of the stories of his teachers, because he's got one goal in mind. Yeah, thank you very much. It's a really good point. Zanira, please.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair. That was so
Alaikum
beautiful. I just wish you hadn't
Fiki.
slipped over some of the stories because they were really interesting. But so I was just wondering, a lot of the images, I mean, I think the sort of classification of the saints. I was just wondering, I mean, we've had this conversation before, but I just want to know, like, in detail, or like just from the sources itself. When I look at some of the names, they have they invoke the imagery of a tent, right? The Qutb
Yes.
and the Awtad, for instance.
Yes.
So it's like if the universe is like a tent, and the Qutb is kind of like the central, I think Josh just said center,
Yes.
of the pole, and then the Awtad are like, I guess, what do you call them? Pegs
Pegs.
that holds, that holds the tent. So I was just wondering how far this imagery applies with, let's say, reference to some of the other names or the titles, because I wasn't able to see all of them. And in general, like if that is how the universe is held in place, because like you said, that, the reason or the creation, they fulfill the purpose of creation by existing and by knowing Allah.
Yes.
So I was just wondering about like just that image and the symbolism of that.
I don't know how far we can carry the metaphor. I just know it carries to the Qutb and the Awtad. If you try and take it further than that, it doesn't. I don't know if the image actually works, right? But I'm pretty sure it works for Ibn al-Arabi because he gives like very specific numbers for each category, and that actually brings us back to Eric Winkle if you want to read his works again, because he illustrates the categories of saints geometrically again, like I've said before, geometrically. Which means if you're talking about a tent, it's like a triangular shape, sort of, which means the numbers are a reflection of some kind of spiritual geometry. So then it would be more about the numbers that he describes, the numbers that he states for these categories, and how they work out in math and geometry. This is the sort of question that's like perfect for Shuaib. I'm an idiot in math, so I just do taslim. But really, this question would be perfect for him.
I'm sorry, for who? Who did you say it's perfect for?
Eric Winkle. His name is also Shuaib.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Well, we should end it there. We're at the hour and a half mark. So, Jazakallah khairan Sidi for all of your teachings. We'll post this soon, hopefully within the next 24 hours, for those who like to review it or haven't seen it.
I'll take a question from Ravina, but whoever's got to go, please go. Please don't feel like you gotta stay. But yeah, I'll take a question from Ravina, and if you gotta go, just go. It's fine.
Okay, thank you. It was interesting, the story with the fish, and I was wondering if there is some kind of hidden meaning behind the fish, because I see the fish being very symbolic in many cases, starting from the Quran with the meeting of Musa and Khidr, and then the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that says that the fish make dua for the knowers. Or I don't know exactly the wording, but I was wondering if there is
Maybe you're right, totally. Scholars ask themselves that same question about so many of Ibn Arabi's stories. I'll think about it. Yeah, good question. Thanks. Thank you so much. All right, lovely people. See you next week, inshallah.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Allah yafikum. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
جزاكم الله خيرا. السلام عليكم.
وعليكم السلام.